Recording is in progress.
All right, yeah, we've begun. So this is the second session. You're in room 8. It says utilizing paired programming in the classroom, the benefits for teachers and students. So we have Eric and Sam here today from Code Central, and they're going to be your guides through this session. So welcome everyone and enjoy.
Great, thank you very much, Jason. I appreciate it. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I know there were many choices on the menu for each session, so we appreciate you being with us. So today we would like to discuss the many benefits for both students and teachers in relation to paired programming and focus on the how-to for teachers to make the most out of this learning approach. So our objective today is really to provide you with tools to effectively implement paired programming into your classroom. And if you haven't already, if you can just in the chat, let us know what your position is. Are you a middle school teacher, elementary teacher, admin, etc.? Would be helpful for us. So thank you again for joining us. Just a brief preview of what we'll be covering today. We're going to talk about a couple different coding instruction formats, what they look like. We're going to compare the two. We'll then talk about what exactly is paired programming and the different components of it. We'll move on to prepping for your classroom, as for getting ready to implement, and then we'll move into actually implementing it. And then we'll also talk about adjustments for challenges that you might encounter along the way. And we'll leave some time at the end for some Q&A if anyone has any questions at the end. So my name is Eric Mendelson. Joining me is Sam Cornelius. We're both with Code Central. Code Central, we are a Nevada-based learning center. We have 2 locations here in the Vegas area. We also offer live instruction, which we've been doing since 2019. So we got a little head start on the COVID shutdown. We were able to transition very easily into online instruction. So now we're providing both in person and online. And in September of last year, we had our curriculum accredited by the Nevada Department of Education as approved materials for all classrooms in the state and meeting the middle school computer science standards. So we're very excited about that. And we now have our curriculum available to teachers and schools to implement in the classroom. We're currently working with a 6th grade computer science class at Somerset Academy. And what we offer is pretty much everything that you need to deliver an effective classroom learning experience for your students, including a comprehensive gamified learning management system with a variety of teacher tools. We offer professional development and ongoing support. And so just as a opening, just want to tell you a little bit about Code Central. Both Sam and I were on the writing team that helped to create the K-12 writing standards a few years ago. Wow, I guess it was 2018? It seems more recent, but I guess it was a while ago. So again, we'll have time for questions at the end. And if you want any more information about our curriculum and what we offer, we can provide that to you afterwards. So thank you again for joining us. I'm going to turn over to Sam. Sam is our curriculum director. He's responsible for really spearheading our curriculum. We used to use third-party curriculums when we first opened, and based on what we learned of what was working and wasn't working based on our work with students, we created our own. And so being on the writing team really helped inform us on making sure that we met the standards. And so without further ado, I will hand it off to Sam.
Thank you very much. So as Eric mentioned, we are implementing our curriculum within a middle school computer science class currently. And so a lot of what we're talking about today is going to be based off of our observations and what we've seen has effectively worked in the classroom. During all of this, we will be showing examples from our own curriculum platform. However, that doesn't mean that it can't be done in the curriculum platform that you are actively using. So whatever method you are using, these steps will still be able to apply to you. So to start off with, we want to talk about coding instruction formats. Generally, there are two kinds of instruction formats that you might find when you're implementing coding for your students. So before we talk about paired programming, it's good to lay the groundwork of the kinds that you can find. Starting it off, we have our step-by-step directions. Now, these are pretty straightforward. What you're looking at is you've got your project cards. It can be video games, it can be websites, it can be robots, whatever you're doing, you've got a final project designed for the end, something that they get to see. And they are generally followed by, they're generally formatted in a set of directions and a picture associated with it that the students are following step by step. Some advantages of step-by-step directions include larger scale projects, because when you're following these directions, students don't necessarily need to know everything about coding in order to create these larger projects, because they have the directions guiding them. It allows you to cover more concepts in a single class session. Being that these are larger projects, you are combining if statements with variables, with while loops, with functions, and students get to learn about all of that in one big project. And then finally, it increases student excitement because they see these larger projects created that otherwise might not have been immediately accessible to them. The other side of coding instruction is the open-ended challenges. Examples of that include just individual concepts. You're just learning about the not logical operator. You're just learning about while loops. You have a singular concept that you read up on through a brief lecture, and then students are going to solve a challenge. And that challenge generally doesn't get too terribly big, and it's focusing on that one thing that students are attempting to solve for. Advantages of open-ended challenges come in the forms of demonstrating mastery of singular concepts. Because they're just learning about one thing, you know that you are laying the foundation with individual building blocks. They have more identifiable vocabulary per class session. If you know that you're only covering one concept, you generally will only have that one vocabulary word, so it's easier to really nail that in to make sure that the students fully understand. And then finally, overall, it's just a faster lesson for your students. If your students might not be the kind who wants to do these larger projects over several days, you know that these are generally done in a single session, and their final bits of code don't generally get that large. Now, both are very good at what they do when it comes to introducing concepts, and there is no one right way. You can use just step-by-step, you can just use open-ended, or you can use a mixture of both, whatever works best for you. Now let's talk about how it applies to paired programming. So for those of you who have done paired programming, who have done computer science, this part is going to be more of a refresher, but for those who have never seen paired programming and are interested to see how you can implement it into your classroom, the concept of paired programming is as such. You have two roles because it is a pair. Student number one in the pair is the driver. The driver is doing the coding. They are behind the wheel of this so-called vehicle, and they are the ones with the coding environment up in front of them, whether it be Scratch, whether it be Visual Studio, whatever the case is, they've got the code. Then you have the navigator. The navigator is the backseat driver. They are guiding the coder through reading the directions, they've read the concepts, and they are telling the driver what to do. So now let's go ahead and break that down so you can see what role, what responsibilities each role has in the grander scheme of things. For the driver, again, they are the ones that are actually doing the coding. They will generally be keeping their eyes on their own screen. The way that we've seen it work best is if both students have their own computers, one driver has their computer and it has the coding environment open, and the navigator on their side has the coding directions. So the driver really only looks at their own screen. They are following the directions given to them by the navigator. They are not reading the directions themselves. This is very important for paired programming to be as successful as it can be. And, oh yeah, and there it is. They rarely look at the directions themselves until a role change. And the role change we'll talk about a little later, but essentially you do want to make sure that everyone gets a chance to be the driver and everyone gets a chance to be the navigator. On the navigator side of things, they are doing a lot less coding and they are guiding verbally for the driver what they are going to be doing next. They are keeping track of both screens. They have their screen, which has the directions open, and then they're going to be looking over at the driver's screen to ensure that what they're telling the driver to do is being filled out correctly. When a navigator is telling a driver what to do, they are more likely to notice if, say, a typo comes in. If a student types something incorrectly, a navigator will be able to spot that. They are going to be reading the directions for the driver to code. Again, the driver doesn't look over. The driver keeps their eyes on the road at all times. And they are actively explaining what they see in the directions to their partner. So they're not just saying the steps. It's important that the navigator also reads those concepts that are found in the step-by-step directions and explains it to the driver, so the driver is also in on the why are we doing this. And then there's going to be the concept of switching roles. We have our drivers, we have our navigators, but you don't want them to just be that for the entirety of your class semester. You want to make sure that they have a chance to get up and change seats. So we'll talk about this a little later, but what you'll want to do is identify a good point in the curriculum for students to change roles. And this can come in various shapes and sizes depending on the curriculum that you're following and depending on the projects that your students are working on. We've seen that it's the most fun when they physically change seats. So not just having them change their computer screens, but actually getting up and then turning over and sitting in each other's chairs. It really hits home the fact that we are now filled with different responsibility than what we were doing before. And it's also just super fun. The students get a real big kick out of it, especially if they all do it at the same time. It's a lot of shuffling and it's pretty fun to watch. And then this also ensures that all students have the opportunity to code, because if one student is always the driver, that means the navigator never gets to do any of the fun coding. And the driver is never going to get a chance to actually read the directions for themselves and get a better idea about what the directions have been asking them up until this point. So we do want to make sure that students have that opportunity to see a little bit of everything. Some educational benefits that you can find when you implement paired programming into your classroom are: this strengthens peer-to-peer communication between students. When you have students actively talking to each other, one student telling the other what they're supposed to be doing, and the driver responding if maybe the directions weren't clear or they don't know why they're typing certain things, and so the navigator must respond based off of what they see in their directions and maybe reword it in their own words, they are developing the idea that, how can I reword this so that my partner can understand what they're supposed to be doing? This is an incredibly valuable skill for your students to have. This is also an effective class management tool. If you are teaching a classroom and you have 30 plus students, that is a lot of students to keep track of, especially when it comes to computer science projects, because some of these can be quite extensive and cover a lot of topics. And if you have 30 students all working through these projects, that is 30 individual kids. However, when you implement paired programming, and now instead of 30, the way that you see that is because when you have students and they are communicating more one-on-one with each other, if they run into any challenges, let's say that there's a bug in their code and something isn't working correctly, you want to make sure, you want to give your students that opportunity to try and solve it for themselves. When a student is working more one-on-one, they're just working by themselves. If they've done the directions and there's a bug, they don't have as much incentive to try and solve it on their own, and their hand's going to immediately go up. But if they have a partner that they can refer to and ask them to recheck that part of the directions, they're more likely to try and solve that. And so you'll have even less questions because they're figuring it out on their own, which is how it works in the real world. So we want to encourage that within the classroom. And then this develops real world skills. In the real world, we don't generally work one-on-one. We work in a group, we work in teams. So if your students are from a very young age learning how to work in a team, learning how can you be an effective team partner and get you to that final end goal, is going to better prepare them for the workforce when they then need to code out in there. Now we're going to move on into prepping prepared programming. So we've talked about the introduction, how you can understand it and see the concepts, but how does it work in your classroom? First thing that we want to do is identify your good pairings ahead of time based on the criteria that you feel is best. If you know who your pairs are before they come into the classroom, it's going to set up your classroom for better success because you're not going to be trying to figure it out on that first day when you're still trying to get to know everyone. So if you have a roster of the students that you will have for each class period, I would highly encourage you to go through that roster and ahead of time put them in a seating chart. So that way you know who your pairs are going to be, and whatever criteria you want is the criteria that will work. It can be where you have a stronger student working with a student who has more difficulties. You can pair two students together who are around the same level. Whatever way works good for you to ensure the most success within your classroom. And then, of course, because they're working in pairs, you want to make sure that you determine that they are going to be sitting together and determine which one will be which role. Generally, it's good to say one on the left, you are the driver, one on the right, you're the navigator. That way there's no question over it and they're less likely to fight over who's going to be what when the actual day comes. Classroom introduction. This one is an important one because if you don't effectively communicate how paired programming works to your classroom, your students may get a little confused on what they're supposed to be doing. So you want to make sure that when the day begins, all your students are there, they've been seated down and they're ready to code, that you make sure to give them a brief introduction to what paired programming is. Now, an effective introduction introduces the driver and navigator roles. This can be in a form similar to what I had shown earlier. It can be something that you create yourself. There's a ton of resources out there for introducing paired programming. So whatever one that you find that you feel comfortable with will be perfect for your needs. An effective introduction also encourages the pair to get to know each other. They are partners. They're going to be working together for the rest of the semester. You want to make sure that they have a chance to say hi to each other, give each other a high five, make sure that they are on a first name basis and they're ready to succeed in the classroom for coding. You also want your introduction to specify when these students should be changing their roles. So again, this will be talked about a little later where we can identify those points, but you'll want to make sure that your students know when is a good time to be the driver and when is it time to get up from your chair and move over to be the navigator. And then, of course, your introduction should also emphasize the fun factor of student collaboration, because we know how it is. You get in front of the classroom, you tell them, okay, we're going to be paired up in groups. Some students might roll their eyes or groan. So you want to make sure you emphasize, this is going to be awesome for you guys. You're going to have so much fun doing this, and it's going to be a good time. So now let's talk about when it's best to change roles. So every curriculum that is out there will probably be organized a little differently. Using our curriculum as an example, we have them separated into sections or chapters, if you will. And so in our curriculum, we encourage roles to change at the end of a section because it's a nice clean breakaway where you are now on to a new concept. So students know it's time to get up and move over. In other curriculums, let's say it's more video-based, it could be at the end of a video. If some curriculums you follow, they are just very small bite-sized projects, you can just have them do driver and navigator the same throughout the entire project, and then change roles when it comes time to the next project. Whatever one works good for you, you want to make sure you determine that ahead of time based on the curriculum that you are following. And most importantly, stay consistent with that change roles so your students can identify and change roles more independently when you are having your students do independent work. That way, they're not going to be asking you constantly, when do we change roles? They will know based off of a very clear guide that you set for them when is best to change those roles. And then something that sometimes comes up, it's never a comfortable conversation, but definitely needs to be talked about, is when should you adjust your partner assignments? You've got it all set up, day one, they're all sitting there and they're ready to code, but then somewhere your partner assignments didn't go the way that you expected. It's never fun, but it does happen. So here's some warning signs to look out for on this is a good time for you to potentially adjust your partner assignments. First one is teamwork challenges. Teamwork challenges is where your students are just not meshing together and they are kind of butting heads a little bit more than you would like, where they're not interacting as well. When this happens, this is probably a good sign to separate those students and give them different partners based on why you think that those students were not interacting well. We also have productivity challenges. This can come in two forms. One is that they get along a little too well. They're talking more about Pokemon or Fortnite or what they're going to be doing at recess. You know, the classic, they are just talking more about anything other than the code at hand, which is fine if you've got like a lull moment, but if it's a constant thing, maybe it's time to separate them out because you know that they're already friends so they can hang out later. And then there's also the opposite where they spend too much time just kind of staring off into the distance and not being productive, and neither of them really have that drive to push the other. That would be another instance of adjusting your partner assignments. And then finally, behavioral challenges. When students are getting a little easily riled up, and that can generally come in many different forms, and the triggers for that can vary from student to student. But if you're noticing that students are getting a little extra angry, perhaps there's something that the other student is doing that's getting them all riled up. Maybe it's something where the students are just not feeling very comfortable. Whatever the case is, if you're noticing behavioral challenges, you don't want to put either student at risk. So that's another instance of rearranging your partner assignments to cater to make sure that your students are as comfortable as possible. If they're not comfortable with their partners, they're not going to have a valuable learning experience, and we don't want that. We want them to have fun. So now that we've gone over that, another thing about paired programming is making sure that you are grading them as a pair. This one I know is kind of a given, but just to make sure that it is said, if two students are working together on a project, they're generally going to have a group grade because of that. Depending on the curriculum platform you use, they may have a paired programming tool set up for you. I know of a few that use it. Our curriculum also has a platform. Our curriculum platform also has the ability to pair up your partners so you know when a project was completed, which two students actually completed that project. So when they get their comprehension score or whatever grade comes from the platform that they used it from, you want to make sure that both students have it. And then finally, a real quick talk about adjusting for open-ended challenges. An open-ended challenge is a tad different. You can still do the driver and navigator role, but in the case of, for instance, our curriculum example, those challenges tend to be pretty short, and perhaps the driver navigator role might end up becoming something where one student ends up doing all the work, which is something that we had found happen when we were implementing paired programming and they were doing open-ended challenges. One student obviously had a much better understanding of what was going on, and so they just did all the work, and the other student just kind of leaned back, waited for the student to finish, and then just took the code for themselves. And that means that they're not getting a good learning experience out of it. So what we would recommend is, instead of doing your driver navigator, they are now just partners. So they are both going to be coding at the same time. And the way that that works is both partners are going to read the concept together. You can make it where they read on their own separate screens, or for that sense of camaraderie, I would recommend having them both read on the same screen so they're following along at the same pace. Once they've read the concept or the lecture at the same time, they then should attempt the challenge separately without looking over at each other's screens. I'm sure a little screen peeking will still happen from time to time, but ultimately they should be trying to solve the challenge on their own. Once they have done that and they both think that they've completed the challenge, they then compare their approaches. I guarantee you they're both going to have a very different approach to those challenges, and it could be where one student understood the challenge better, but the other student had written more syntactically correct code. And so now you've identified the strengths of your students and where their shortcomings are and what they need to work on. And they're able to identify that through their partners. Oops. So I didn't realize that was the last slide. So when they've done that, you're able to get them to better understand what's going to be needed from them for accomplishing these challenges. And you've now ensured that they're both working on the code at the same time, and not one student is doing all of the work. So now some quick final thoughts before we open up to Q&A. Is paired programming is an excellent learning tool for both teachers and students. For the teachers, it's going to help you with your class management. It's going to help you build more independent students who are able to solve challenges on their own. And it is an engaging way for your students to develop real life world skills within the classroom. For the students, it's giving them the opportunity to have someone to work with so they don't feel alone when they're tackling these concepts, because computer science is still a very new thing for a lot of our students, and it can be a little daunting. So if they have someone that they know that they're working with, they've got a partner in crime, if you will, this is going to give them the confidence they need when they're building up and delving into this new world of computer science that for them could be for the very first time. Make sure that you are clearly introducing your driver and navigator to your class, and this will set you up for success. If your students know that one has a responsibility and another has another responsibility, they're going to take that and they're going to go with it. They're going to take that responsibility as if it's their job, and they're going to they're going to have a sense of empowerment based on the fact that I have this I need to do, and I'm going to make sure that make sure this, this paired programming approach ensures that everyone still gets a chance to code while also helping them take breaks here and there where they're not just coding every time that they're in your class for that 18-week semester. And then this also creates a supportive and collaborative environment, as I mentioned earlier, for your students to feel like they have an extra person that they can lean on, and they can build those collaborative environments for you. Sorry, you can build a collaborative environment for your students, so everyone has a chance to build off of what the other knows. And then finally, students will have fun building those real world skills. So when they go and they want to make their own video game, attend, I don't know, a game jam, or just when they graduate and they're off in the real world, they will then see, I've done this before. I know what I'm doing, and now I'm ready to tackle it. So with that, I just want to say thank you all for joining us, and I do want to now have a chance to open this up for Q&A. If anyone has any questions, any comments, anything that you guys want to bring up in regards to maybe you've done paired programming and have something that you want to state about it, or something wasn't quite as clear as you'd like it to be and have more questions, this is now the best time for it. So does anyone have any questions for me?
Do you have any suggestions of when you have students, like a class is an odd number or students are absent? What's the best way to kind of handle that? If their partner isn't there, what's the best way to deal with that?
That's always a fun one to deal with, when a student's like, oh yeah, they didn't come because they didn't feel like it, or on the opposite end, you know, they didn't feel well. In my experience, what we've done is one of two things. If it is like a one-off thing, sometimes what we'll do is we'll have that student who's generally in a pair then work more solo for just that class session. So they are then their own driver and navigator. That does mean that the student who wasn't there is missing out on some of the lecture, but they already kind of missed out on the lecture. And if you don't have some kind of system in place to allow them to move forward, you run the risk of then having the entire class falling behind, which is also not fun. So I would recommend, in the terms of an absence, have your student work more solo for that one class period. If you have an odd number of students, we've done a couple of different things for that. One is that when we know in advance it's an odd number of students, when we've gone through the roster, we find a student that we feel is a pretty strong student on their own, and from the get-go, we just won't do paired programming for them. It's not always ideal, but it is something where it has happened. And while computer science is very new for a lot of students, every classroom, you always have that one student who does Unreal programming off to the side. So if you can identify who that student is, I would recommend having that student be more solo, because they probably wouldn't even necessarily like the paired programming environment and would feel even held back by it. So find your student who's done coding in advance and then have them be more of a lone wolf from the get-go. And then still occasionally find like other opportunities for them to do collaborations, whether it be one-offs or unplugged activities.
Thank you.
Of course. That was a very good question. Does anyone else have any questions?
So I have a share. I actually did it for the very first time this week with practically with first grade and then with kindergarten. And I can tell you the first grade one went super, super well. And the kindergarten one so far has been, I've only done one. And the kindergarten one was herding kittens and trying to get them back on the carpet. So there is a big jump between those grade levels, and that's typical.
Very much so, yeah.
But when you, I think the question that I have currently is, I tended to pair up this week with people who were more capable and less capable. And so the pairing just seems like in my mind, certainly that person who's not as good is learning from that other person, but I just also feel like they're probably, like dragging a boulder, carrying that person. Not that that mostly any of them are that super coder who you might just assign independently because they wouldn't like it if they were paired up with somebody who didn't know anything, but just ones that clearly have the idea and ones that are having a harder time. And so I don't know, like it's hard to say who, when you go to grade it at the end, it seems like the one person is doing the work in the pair. And the other person, is just getting the benefit of being someone who's with someone who's capable.
Right. And that's why the more open-ended challenges can help you kind of identify that, because when you have your projects, it is quite often one student is doing a lot more work, which is why we encourage the swapping. But even in the swapping, we have noticed students will just kind of go over and just mess with the other student's computer to just do it for them. If you find that, because when we have a not a larger, but a more capable student mixed with a less capable student, there's kind of two outcomes that I've seen. One, the more capable student takes on the challenge of being a mentor incredibly well and really helps build that student up and to get them to that same level. Those are the pairings you want to encourage and keep going, because you see that the more capable student has a new kind of learning experience that wasn't in the curriculum, the learning experience of being a mentor. So now you have another grading criteria. And then for the other student is how well are you able to build off of your mentor to build yourself up? And so now that's another grading criteria for them outside of what the curriculum had. However, there's also the other instance where one student's just doing all the work and the other student isn't. In cases like that, that is what I would consider either a teamwork or a productivity challenge, probably more a teamwork challenge with one doing more work. And maybe that would be a good instance to potentially rework that pairing and put that more capable student with someone who will challenge them if they're not taking that mentor role very well. And then the less capable student with maybe another student who's also struggling, and give extra special attention to that group to now they know they have more responsibility in order to keep up, as long as it doesn't overwhelm them. It's always a tricky situation because you don't know what kinds of students you're going to have. So it's we always got to play it by ear based on our students, because sometimes one more capable, one less capable is very effective, and sometimes perhaps not as effective depending on your students at hand.
Right. It is always driven by the specific people. And that's not just with this, it's with any subject area you're working with.
Very much so. How about anyone else? Has anyone implemented paired programming in their classroom with any notes that they have? Any other questions that has come up that maybe you'd like more clarification on? Either in the chat or otherwise? I'm getting a lot of radio signs, so I think that means that we're good to go, and a little early, which may be a good or bad thing depending on who you are, but I always like it when meetings end a little early. So one final thing, I just want to just give ourselves a quick little shameless plug. Everything that we've shown in this presentation has been directly through our learning platform. We are an accredited curriculum for grades 6 through 8. So if you are a middle school teacher and would like to implement an accredited curriculum into your classroom, and you have more questions about maybe implementing our service into there, you can reach out to either Eric or myself, depending on just whichever name you remember. And if you are an elementary school teacher, we are unfortunately not yet accredited. However, our curriculum is still up to state standards. It's just not officially recognized by Nevada as of yet, but it does go into great depth on coding for younger students, grades 3 through 5. Not so much the kindergartners or 1-year-olds, because they tend to need a slightly different curriculum. But if you do have questions on how to implement computer science into your classroom and would like more information, please feel free to reach out to us. Mr. Erickser, do you have any final words to say?
No, I just want to thank everyone for joining us. Robert, thank you for your input and contribution of your experience. Jason, thank you so much for moderating. And as Sam said, feel free to reach out to us if there's any support that we can provide for you. And we'll hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
All right, thank you, Sam and Eric. And I've put the session evaluation link and the title of the session in the chat, so you can do that before you go. The next session starts at 11:25. So once you're ready to head out, you can feel free to leave and join whatever session you're going to attend for number 3, starting at 11:25. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank
Have
you
a
all
good
very much.
one.